Well, I think one of the things to realize is that persecution and martyrdom is not a thing of the past or the early church. It's ongoing. And in fact, in the 20th century, more Christians were martyred in that century than all other centuries. And by most people's reckonings, by more Christians were martyred in the 20th century than in all other centuries combined. This is Fixed on Jesus. Hey everybody, welcome back to Fixed on Jesus. This is the podcast at Center Church by members of Center Church for Center Church of Gilbert, Arizona. We are today, as always, we have the same group that has been here from the beginning. We've got Mark Johnson Jr. How you doing, Mark?
Here I am.
There you are. And Heather Corbitt back there across the way, not behind a glass, but metaphorically, figuratively behind a glass. How you doing, Heather?
I'm good, thanks.
That doesn't sound very convincing.
No, I really am. I really am. Don't say anymore.
Normally you have a smile in your voice. That time you didn't. That's what I'm just
And a
pointing it
sarcastic
out.
answer from time to time.
Oh, now let's
Time to
not.
time.
Let's not. But her speech is seasoned with salt.
It is.
All right. So
Yeah,
what are we
for the
talking
building
about
up.
today, Mark?
We're talking about the economic impact of tariffs at the macro and micro. Oh, right. Wrong podcast.
We're not doing that.
We're talking about Christian martyrs throughout the
Even though
history.
people have a lot of opinions about tariffs right now.
I thought you just said we weren't talking about that.
We're not. I'm just
Okay.
saying people have a lot of opinions about tariffs.
It was well timed. Yeah.
It was. Okay. So
Christian martyrs. I was reading.
martyrs. Okay. Yes.
Yeah, I was reading Acts through the book of Acts as part of a reading plan, and I got to Acts 7, and we see Stephen's, which
Yep.
I believe you said was the longest speech
Yeah.
in the Bible.
Yeah. So if you read Acts 7, there's three big speeches, big sections. Two are
Yeah.
Paul's, and one is Stephen's. Stephen's is the longest.
Right.
And he actually, if you read it, he goes through a 30,000 foot view of the history of Israel.
Yeah, it was almost like the first part of the biblical theology storyline.
Exactly. And it's fascinating because he's debating a synagogue of so-called the freedmen, right? So he's part of the early church, probably a convert from Pentecost. When the Spirit falls upon the people get saved. He's added to that group. The apostles are leading the church, and they're in close quarters with Jewish people, and there was a bunch of just raging debate as to whether or not Jesus was Messiah, how Christianity interacts with Judaism and things like that.
Yeah.
And so Stephen was commissioned by the apostles to give food to
And then 6 others.
him. Yeah, 7 of them, to give food to widows from Hellenistic widows, and he's doing that, but he's also evangelizing, right?
Yeah.
He's not just waiting tables,
Right.
Although he was doing that, he was organizing that work, but he was also interacting with people.
Full of the Spirit.
Yeah. And so and then he ends up debating these people who are, authorities or, some kind of leaders in the synagogue of the freedmen. And the thing to realize about Acts 7 is the whole time he's talking, everybody would have been nodding their heads. That's right. Until he gets to verse 51 and he says, this is what gets him stoned. You stiff-necked people, uncircumcised in heart and ears. You always resist the Holy Spirit as your fathers did, so do you. Which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute, and they killed those who announced beforehand the coming of the righteous one, whom you now betrayed and murdered? You received the law as delivered by angels and did not keep it, which is absolutely true. And so they rejected Messiah. But that if you read the story of Israel is not just a story of them rejecting the Messiah. They also reject all the prophets that come when God sends prophets to call people back to faithfulness, and they reject those prophets. And Stephen calls them out and says, you're just like your fathers who rejected all the prophets. Then they get angry, and then they get enraged. The text says they grind their teeth at him, and then they stone him and kill him. And then beginning right then becomes a big persecution in the church. So the church in Jerusalem the church, all the Christians ever converted at the time, they're all in Jerusalem. They're still meeting in the temple in the Solomon's portico. Then Stephen gets stoned, and all of a sudden a persecution begins of the church that starts that day. And you can read about that in Acts 8:1. It says, and there arose on that day a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. And so the church, the thousands of people are scattered.
Yeah.
But like, a daffodil or a dandelion, not a daffodil, a dandelion, they go all over the ancient Near East, taking the gospel, and it ends up spreading. Yeah.
And just the part at the end of Acts 7, at the end of his at the end of his stoning, just gives me the chills. Starting Acts 7, verse 60, and falling to his knees, he cried out with a loud voice, Lord, do not hold this sin against them. And when he had said this, he fell asleep.
Yeah. Isn't that great?
Man.
Yeah. I mean, he's reflecting
in that
Jesus.
moment.
He's reflecting Jesus, right?
Yeah.
It's like, here's Stephen in his sanctification, his transformation. He ends up in the last moment of his life emulating Jesus. Well, and it's interesting. Luke says he fell asleep.
Yeah.
That's something to mark too. I mean, he was dead, right?
Yeah.
He's dead.
He was putting it kindly.
But he felt, that's a Christian way of saying that one day Jesus is going to wake him up. At the end of the age, you'll see.
I didn't catch that.
Throughout the New Testament, you'll see saints that have fallen asleep. That means.
So it's a foreshadowing of the new heavens and new earth.
Well, it's
or
fallen asleep. Where it just like there's every Christian that dies has fallen asleep. And one day a trumpet will sound, and the Lord will come back and will wake us all up.
Yeah.
And so that's where this isn't the purpose of the podcast, but when you think about death, death for a Christian is as scary as taking a nap.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you what, I have never been afraid to take a nap. Have you, Mark?
No, I do them regularly.
Yeah, exactly.
Have them regularly.
Yeah, right. Never afraid to take a nap. And that's death for the Christian, because one day Jesus will wake us up. One day we'll be woken up with Stephen.
Yeah.
And we'll be with Jesus and be like Jesus and see him as he is.
Love that. And I just felt like those last couple verses, that last verse points to and helps us define a martyr.
Mm-hmm.
There's someone who gave up their life or was persecuted to the point of death for their sake of the faith and what they believe.
Yeah, the word martyr originally just meant witness. You could be a martyr, like a witness in a case, right?
Yeah.
But then all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but as Christians witness of Jesus and what they saw and how their lives changed, the word martyr changed and became someone who was a witness unto death, like Stephen.
Yeah.
And in part, that's some of the story of the early church is the story of people being martyred, witnessing unto death.
What are some of the other good ones after Stephen? And then once you go through some of those, I want to know, like, what was the effect? And when you say...
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, all of the 12 apostles died a martyr's death except John.
What happened to John?
John died of old age. Even though history tells us he was put in a boiling vat of oil, it didn't kill him. John was the only one who died of natural causes.
The one whom Jesus loved?
The one who Jesus loved, and the one who wrote Revelation.
Yeah.
That John. And he's the only one who died of natural causes. James, the apostle, was the first one who was martyred.
Brother.
Not his brother, the apostle, sometimes called James the Great. He was beheaded. There were, all kinds of stories. You can read Foxe's Book of Martyrs, Foxe. apostrophe S, his book of Martyrs. There's like, he'll give you the history of at least, we don't have a ton of information, but there's rumors about like Thomas made it all the way to India and stuff like that.
Oh yeah.
So like you can read about that kind of stuff in there. But
Thomas that didn't believe.
Yeah, he was confident. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Thomas, who wanted to feel the marks on Jesus' hand,
exactly.
but then died a martyr's death.
Absolutely, he did. Yeah,
that.
absolutely. Yeah, he did. So James was the first of the 12 to be martyred. He was beheaded.
By under Roman authorities, would it be? Or
yeah, Romans. Let's see. Romans would have beheaded him, I believe. Yeah, Jews stoned people. Or
the Jews did.
Yeah.
Is just maybe this? I don't know if this is just because I didn't grow up in the church. Was stoning a cultural thing, so nobody has the personal responsibility of killing someone? Is it like a firing squad?
I think it's more of a, not like that. It's more like a community response to heresy.
Okay.
So everybody's playing a role. So
nobody knows who's the one who murdered someone.
They're not worried about that. They all played a part in murdering.
So they're all murderers.
They don't think about it as murderers. They think about it as like defending the truth.
I see.
So it's a community response.
Okay.
So anyway, Peter was crucified, but he was crucified upside down because he didn't count himself worthy to be crucified right side up like Jesus.
Wow.
Yeah.
He got to make that request.
He did, and they honored it. That's what history tells us.
Yeah.
Paul was beheaded.
After being in jail for a while.
He was in jail. We got him in jail at the end of Acts.
For a hot minute.
And then he goes back out. Then he gets back in prison, and that's the end of 2 Timothy, where he's dying. He gets beheaded after that.
Whew. I don't think people realize how much.
Tons of blood. Yeah.
How much blood was involved in the early church.
Tons. James, the brother of Jesus, the guy who led the Jerusalem church after the apostles left.
Wasn't he a late convert?
He was later. He's Jesus' brother, yeah. And he's the one who chaired the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15.
Come on, James, be like your brother.
Yeah, right.
James, where's your faith?
That?
Your brother.
Yeah,
That'd be tough.
Imagine that. It'd be hard, yeah.
Fill.
But he was a leader in his own right. He was thrown off the top of the temple and killed by the Jews. Later, and that's just the reality. I mean, there were all those early church leaders were martyred, and then it just continued. Like there's some famous other people like Polycarp.
Yeah, Polycarp
was one of like an early martyr. They say he was martyred at about
300,
155 or so.
I guess.
Yeah, that was a guess. Burned at the stake. And there's just like, if you look at the history of the church is awash in blood.
Is there more that we should mention, or do you want to go into the effects of that?
Yeah, I mean, you can just like down through every generation, down through every century, there's always been people who have been martyred for their faith, for their witness in Jesus Christ, right? And so you can look from the early parts of the, like the early church into the medieval church, into the Reformation era, even up to modern day. There's always, somewhere around the world, there's always some group of Christians being persecuted.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. Yeah, like before we go into the modern day, what was the effect on the early church with what would happen? What was the consistent pattern that happened every time someone was martyred? Yeah,
so the consistent pattern is, it's so counterintuitive, like so many things are, right? We've got, in Acts chapter 8, Luke tells us that there began that day a persecution. And the church, if you think about everything stacked against that church was like significant. And you think, man, the persecution starts, that church is dead. They're going to be crushed. They're going to be like in a vice grip, and they're just going to be crushed. Yeah. And they're killing the leaders, and they're pursuing the leaders. Saul is trying to imprison leaders, and you think this little fledgling group it's hopeless. It's not working. But that's the opposite's the case. Whenever we have martyrs, the church grows.
Yeah.
And in fact, you can see it like the church is, everybody's like spread out. Everybody's shot out of Jerusalem, And you get this in Acts 11, verse 19. Now those who were scattered because of the persecution of Stephen traveled as far as Phoenicia and Cyrus and Antioch. Those are 3 different directions, speaking the word to no one except Jews. But there were some of them, men of Cyprus and Cyrene, that's North Africa, on coming to Antioch, that's north of Jerusalem, spoke to the Hellenists also, preaching the Lord Jesus. And the hand of the Lord was with them, and a great number who believed turned to the Lord. And so you have, as a result of the persecution, you have expansion of the gospel via the planting of churches. So that doesn't make any sense, but that's how that works. And in fact, that's what you see throughout history. When the church is persecuted and when the martyr's blood is spilt, the church grows, and it gets, like, the church that is existent gets more passionate about the Lord, and the church, and then it legitimizes their witness, right? Some people say that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church.
Wow.
And so that's how that works.
Right. Okay. So let's turn to the modern day. Let's start with America. Obviously the culture now maybe isn't always against Christendom, but it's probably leaning that way.
Yeah,
and maybe in the past it was more favorable.
Yeah.
But either way, there's no strong persecution of Christianity here in the United States for the most part. I mean, that's a blanket statement.
It's mostly it's people saying unkind things to us.
Right. But it's not like murder or throwing people in jail or stoning them.
Not here.
Right. And Lord willing, that never happens here.
Yeah, I think it will, but not yet.
Right. Yeah. Now let's go abroad for a minute.
Yeah.
There's places that we know of where the church is persecuted, where Christianity is illegal. Just to name a couple, I know of, like China, lots of places in the Middle East. Maybe there's other parts that you know of.
Yep.
What do we know about that?
Well, I think one of the things to realize is that persecution and martyrdom is not a thing of the past or the early church. It's ongoing. And in fact, in the 20th century, more Christians were martyred in that century than all other centuries. And by most people's reckonings, more Christians were martyred in the 20th century than in all other centuries combined.
Is that 1901 to 1999 or so?
1901 to 2000, right?
Yeah.
So more people were killed in that century than in all other centuries combined, from the first century to the 19th century. That is a lesser of a number than who was martyred in the 20th century.
But it's not exactly, just to push back, it's not exactly apples to apples, because we've experienced, if you put it in percentage, we've experienced massive population growth in the 20th century.
Hard to say, because there's millions and millions and millions of people. We don't have good population numbers for who is here, like on this continent. So like, but as a number, as a percentage, like
still horrible
and crazy. Like there's evidence that 95% of the people who lived on North and South America in earlier, 1200 and earlier died. And so there's more and more civilization evidence. So I would say that we don't know how much civilization, how big the population was, but the number of people who've died in the 20th century for the cause of Christ eclipses all other centuries.
Yeah.
And so it's a reality now, right? And so one of the things that we have as Americans is that we're insulated.
Yeah.
And so we have a myopic view of the world because we only think about things from a, sea to shining sea perspective.
Yeah.
And there's more going on out there. And I think that that's something for us to grow in is there's a, Voice of the Martyrs. Martyrs is a website that shows different areas of the world that have persecuted churches.
What was the website?
Voice of the Martyrs. And in our men's prayer meeting every Thursday morning at 6, they pray for one part of the world.
That's why there's a map in there.
There's a map in there, yeah. And
it's really cool.
Yeah, and so they're like, there are places that to preach the gospel, it's illegal.
Do you know any of those offhand?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I can tell you a couple stories. One, I won't name the country, but we in Sovereign Grace, part of what we feel called to do is plant churches to spread the gospel. We believe that's the best way to that's the best way for the kingdom to expand is through the planting of local churches, not just having people just go out and preach. And so in one area that it's illegal to be a Christian, we've had the privilege of coming alongside and training pastors who are men of this country, and they're wonderfully godly men, but they in that context is illegal to have theological training. So we actually are able to begin to train them and help them theologically.
Can you tell us what continent? I don't want to risk anything.
It's in Asia.
Okay.
And so we come alongside them and help train them theologically. I mean, but they're training us with with passion for the Lord and everything.
Yeah.
And they
it's mutual training is what you're saying.
Sure, yeah. And so they, like, for example, most of these men are going to be working some other job during the day and pastoring by night. And they're responsible for, some of them, up to 10 different churches.
Wow.
Some of them even as much as 15. And
they're gathering in the home, I'm guessing?
No, they're gathering in secret outside. It's too big. And so we're talking, there was 20 pastors that we were training in this area. And the area has some radical Hindus that would, track them down, burn their homes, persecute them. And those 20 people were connected to 40,000 different folks.
Wow.
And so, like, that's one of the ways we try to help the persecuted church. And we don't realize, like, I have a friend who is serving in Ethiopia, and he's planted a church in Addis Ababa. And in that church, there was a gentleman who is Somali, and he was teaching. So, like, there's Addis Ababa is the big capital city in Ethiopia, teaching people and just about the Lord and everything. And there was a group of women that were he was teaching, and he was preaching the gospel to. And a very common message for us is that there's that at the foot of the cross is level, right? And so there's no hierarchy, right? I have the same access to the Lord as a woman does, as anyone, right? We're all the same, right? In that hierarchical kind of environment, the men did not like it because he was teaching women and their wives that, they have equal access to Jesus just like everyone else, right?
Oh.
And so my friend is, has him in to teach, and then he has coffee with him like a week later or whatever. And this Somali guy, had a hat on and sunglasses and was kind of slouching, and my friend was like, "What's wrong? Are you okay?" And he took off his hat and sunglasses, and he had been beaten to a pulp. And my friend was like, "What happened?" He goes, "Well, preaching the gospel and telling everybody that they're all the same in Christ, there's a lot of people who don't like that." And so this gentleman has been beaten to the point of unconsciousness multiple times, just because he's preaching the gospel. And so, like, we're directly supporting someone who's connected to him and other people, and we're working in that realm, right?
Yeah.
While we may not have in our church, when we live in the United States and we don't have persecution that's happening to us directly, at least physically.
Yeah.
When we give money, anybody who gives to our church, we give a portion to Sovereign Grace, and part of what that goes to is places like Ethiopia, Addis Ababa, where men and women get beaten when they trust Jesus, and other places like that, and possibly martyred.
Yeah. So, that's just to follow up. What can we, as the American church or the non-persecuted church, learn about the zeal that the folks in countries doing gospel ministry have toward the Lord? What can we learn from them? And what can we learn from Martyrs?
I think we can learn from both of them that they know we're not home. We forget that.
Yeah.
We try as people in the U.S. to build heaven on earth, but we're not home. And they know that. I think, like, looking at things with an eternal perspective, the most important thing is not our kids' education. It's not their traveling sports teams. It's not our careers. It's not our reputations. It's not what our retirement looks like. It's where we're going to be for all eternity. Other cultures get that better than we do.
They're forced to make a decision.
Well, they have to, they know, right?
Yeah.
They're not, they're not pursuing the American dream. They're pursuing these people. They're pursuing the Lord, and they know that, all they have is Christ, and to live is Christ, and to die is gain. They know that. And I think we can learn from that. I know I could.
I could too. Yeah. Thank you. And I'm just grateful that we're a part of a church that can contribute to that in some little way. So if this is something you're interested in and something you want to talk more about, feel free to email us at production@centergilbert.com. We just love you, and thanks for listening.
Amen. See you later.